aboard the Quarian ship, Edena. There was a resounding boom as the spaceships made hull-to-hull contact, and Jillian was knocked off her feet.
"Here they come,"
Ugo said over the comm as she picked herself up, and a muffled explosion was heard. The outer hatch had been blown, and the Batarians were in the airlock. Seconds later, the metal around the control panel on the inner door began to glow. Then a jet of plasma punched its way through and began to trace a red-hot line around the box. There was a loud hiss, followed by a clang as one of the slavers gave the control panel a kick and it fell in onto the Edena's deck. Atmosphere was already rushing out, taking anything that wasn't secured with it, but the suction grew even more intense when the Batarians pushed the hatch open. Then, as both sides opened fire, pressures were equalized and the flow of the air stopped. Because of the vacuum, there was no sound other than what came over the comm, so Jillian couldn't hear the gunfire that lashed back and forth. But there was an almost non-stop flow of orders and commentary from Ugo as a phalanx of heavily armored Batarians pushed their way onto the Edena. The weight of their armor slowed the slavers down, but enabled them to take a lot of punishment as the Quarians opened fire on them.
"Hit them hard,"
Ugo urged.
"Chew through their armor. We have to stop them before they can reach the barriers."
From her position toward the rear, where she was mostly concealed behind the last barrier, Jillian could see the wisdom of Ugo's words. The weapons being used by combatants on both sides fired particle-sized rounds at relativistic speeds. That meant a single magazine could hold a lot of rounds, the downside being a steady increase in heat. Failure to eject an old heatsink and replace it with a new one could disable a weapon and leave its owner vulnerable to attack. Just one of the many things Jillian had to remember. A Batarian fell as a steady stream of Quarian projectiles burrowed through multiple layers of protection to find flesh and bone. The result was a horrible-looking geyser as the slaver's bodily fluids were sucked out through the hole in his ruptured suit. The sight was enough to make Jillian feel sick to her stomach as she pointed her pistol at one of the invaders and pulled the trigger. Sparks could be seen as the round struck, but the projectiles made no appreciable difference as the Batarian lumbered forward. Then, an already difficult situation took a turn for the worse as a Krogan mercenary entered the fray. Jillian knew very little about Krogan firearms, but didn't need to see how powerful the newcomer's assault weapon was as he cut two of her fellow crew members down and Ugo rose to throw a grenade. There was a flash of light as it went off, but the effects were minimal. The Krogan fired at Ugo, and the Quarian began to backpedal in a futile attempt to stay vertical. Then it was over as the heavy slugs beat the Quarian's kinetic armor down and tunneled through. The resulting hole was so large that the Quarian's suit ruptured. As Jillian looked on in horror, the vacuum sucked most of Ugo's organs out of his chest cavity and dumped them onto the deck. Jillian felt the emotion boil up from deep inside of her. There had been a time when the combination of anger and grief would have been her undoing, but she had grown since then and learned to use hate as fuel for her talent. So as the Quarians were forced to back away from the barriers and the steadily advancing Krogan, the teenager emerged from hiding. Hendel shouted, "No!" over the comm, but Jillian, now Edena, wasn't listening. The Edena was her ship, Ugo was one of her people, and it was Jillian's duty to protect them. Having returned the pistol to its holster, Jillian raised her hands. Then, having gathered energy until she couldn't contain it anymore, there was no choice but to let go. The Krogan was stomping a wounded Quarian to death as the bolt hit him. In spite of his own size, the monster was plucked off the deck and thrown into a steel bulkhead. He fell, hit the deck hard, and was struggling to rise when Hendel took command. "Now, kill the bastard!" Jillian was already in the process of collecting more energy by then, and as Hendel and the others shot at the Krogan, she targeted a Batarian who was about to circle around the barriers and attack the defenders from behind. The first step was to lift the slaver 20 feet up off the deck. Then, as the terrified Batarian sought to walk on air, Jillian let him go. The Edena's mass effect generators were still on, so the invader came down hard. A leg gave way, he collapsed, and Jillian fired into the Batarian's faceplate. It caved in. Even though it seemed longer, only 10 minutes had passed since the battle had begun. Enough time for Quarians from other parts of the Edena to grab weapons and rush to the trading deck. And their timing couldn't have been better. As Jillian paused to insert a fresh heatsink clip, Quarians flooded into the space and charged the lock. Having lost the Krogan, plus some of their own, the Batarians were forced to turn and run. Hendel was quick to see the opportunity and seize it.
"This is our chance! Follow me!"
And follow him they did, through the Batarian lock and into the Kashan's hall. The lock opened onto the slave deck, and Jillian saw at least 100 slaves seated with their backs to the bulkheads, all locked into place by form-fitting steel cages. But there was very little time to analyze her surroundings as a handful of Batarians turned to fire on their pursuers. Some of the rounds went wide, and a couple of slaves were hit as Hendel shouted, "Kill the bastards! We need to take the control room before they can break loose!" Jillian had been giddy with excitement as she followed the rest of the Quarians onto the Batarian ship, but now she realized how much danger they were in. If the slavers managed to break contact with the Edena, the Quarians would be trapped. That possibility caused Jillian to push her way forward. Having caught up with Hendel, she followed him to the emergency access shaft at the forward end of the compartment.
We can't use the lift,
He explained.
They might shut it down and trap us inside. Be careful, Jillian. You were lucky back on the Edena.
Jillian knew he was right as she swarmed up the ladder to the control deck. It was heavily defended, and this became apparent when projectiles struck Jillian's armor, pushed her back, and forced her to take cover in the shaft.
Freeze him,
Hendel advised from a few rungs below.
but let us squeeze past first.
Some biotics could create a moment of stasis, meaning a mass effect field that could lock an opponent inside, rendering them momentarily invulnerable to attack. And while that ability wasn't as natural to Jillian as propelling an object through the air, she'd been working on it. But would it be effective on targets she couldn't actually see? There was no way to be sure. As Hendel led the others upward, Jillian sought to gather as much energy around her as possible. Having done so, she shaped it into a sphere and saw it freeze some imaginary Batarians in place. Then came the struggle to sustain the stasis field for as long as she could. 3 seconds later, Jillian felt the bubble pop and lunged upward. She stepped out of the shaft with pistol in hand. 6 bodies were scattered around the center of the U-shaped control area, and 3 Batarians stood with hands on top of their heads.
You did it,
Hendel said proudly.
You froze 2 of them and Iban Vasidena. He's pissed, but he'll get over it.
Jillian felt an enormous sense of relief, followed by a sudden emptiness as the after effects caught up with her.
Catch her,
Hendel said, and everything went black. Aboard the Quarian ship Edena. 6 hours had passed since the end of the battle, and Hal McCann felt disappointed. Rather than being freed, he and all the rest of the slaves had been placed under guard and let onto the Quarian ship. It was a sensible precaution, he knew that. The Quarians wanted to find out who the slaves were before turning them loose. So as the ships remained locked together, and the Quarians worked to bring their command and control systems back online, teams of interrogators were interviewing the slaves. Some were freed, but some weren't, and McCann felt a sense of apprehension as a couple of them were led away in handcuffs. The line snaked across the blood-stained trading deck to a table where a couple of Quarians were seated. Finally, having waited through the queue, it was McCann's turn to answer questions. The interrogators were invisible behind their reflective visors, and like many people in the galaxy, McCann had a poor opinion of them.
Name?
Hal McCann. There were humans among the boarding party, 2 of them. I respectfully request that they be present during my interview.
There was a moment of silence as the Quarians looked at each other, then back to him. Had they been communicating via comm? It seemed that way when one of them pointed to a spot off to one side.
Wait there. Next.
McCann did as he was told. His legs were free, but his wrists were still cuffed, and a heavily armed guard was stationed 3 meters away. He didn't have a watch, but what seemed like an hour passed before the humans appeared. McCann was sitting cross-legged on the deck by that time, so he pushed himself up into a standing position as the newcomers went over to speak with the Quarian interrogators. When they came his way, McCann saw that the man was over 6 feet tall, with a closely cropped mustache and goatee. He had rusty brown hair, dark-colored skin, and an air of confidence about him. The girl was shorter, but not by much, and thin. Her hair was black, and pulled back away from a long, narrow face. Her wide-set eyes seemed especially intense somehow, as if the mind behind them was hard at work.
Hal McCann?
The man inquired.
I'm Hendel Mitra. This is Jillian Grayson.
McCann felt a sense of shock so profound that his mouth opened and closed like a newly landed fish.
Jillian Grayson? Paul Grayson's daughter?
Jillian's face brightened.
You know my father?
Well, yes, McCann admitted.
We were on a Cerberus space station at the same time.
Jillian's coal-black eyes seemed to drill holes in him.
Were? What happened?
McCann could tell that the girl wasn't aware of her father's death, and knew he would have to be very careful in order to win his freedom.
The Turians attacked. We fought back, but were outgunned. I took a hit right here.
So saying, McCann pulled his long, unkempt hair aside so the other 2 could see the patch of white scar tissue.
It knocked me out. When I came to, a body was lying on top of me. The Turians were searching them, taking whatever they wanted, so I played dead. And given all the blood on my face, they bought it. Eventually, they carried all the bodies, including mine, off the station and onto a shuttle. Based on what I overheard, the dead were supposed to be transported to a ship. But I knew better than to go along with that. So as soon as the shuttle got underway, I fought my way free of the bodies, took one of the weapons that the Turians had captured from us, and went forward. There was a pilot and a co-pilot. I shot both in the back of the head.
But what about my father?
Jillian wanted to know.
What happened to him?
I didn't know at that point, McCann answered honestly. The shuttle had a basic FTL drive. All I could do was point the shuttle at the nearest Mass Effect relay and head for Omega. I figured that was the best place to go since I had no way to know if the elusive man was still alive. Plus, I was at the controls of a stolen shuttle. So where else could I go? That part of my escape went well. I sold the shuttle at a steep discount, but still walked away with a hefty chunk of change. Then what? Hendel demanded skeptically. McCann looked down at his filth-encrusted boots. I figured I'd take the money and double or even triple it playing Star Cluster. So I went to a Batarian-owned club called Fortune's Den. Don't tell me. You lost all your money, Hendel said disgustedly. Yes, I did, McCann admitted shamefacedly. But I lost more than that. I bet my freedom and lost that as well.
My father,
Jillian insisted.
Tell me about my father.
That's where I heard about him, McCann said as his eyes came back up. Aria Talok had people combing all the bars on Omega looking for him. So when they entered Fortune's Den and said they were looking for a human, the Batarians brought me up out of the basement. Money changed hands and I wound up in front of Talok. But the whole thing was over by then. According to Talok, your father was killed on a space station in orbit around Elysium. Jillian's eyes grew wider.
Grissom Academy. That's where I went to school. You're sure? My father's dead?
McCann shrugged. No, how could I be sure? But Aria had no reason to lie. Not to someone she sold to a Batarian slaver 2 days later. The first emotion Jillian experienced was a deep and abiding sorrow. She was forever cut off from the only person who hadn't been paid to care about her. Paul Grayson had been less than perfect. That was why she and Hendel had been forced to hide aboard the Adena, to escape her father and whatever was controlling him. But she believed that he loved her, to the extent that such a flawed being could love another person, and she loved him in return. In spite of all the things that he had done, she fingered the jewel that hung at her throat as tears trickled down her cheeks.
Who killed him? And why?
McCann had been there. He had seen the horrible things the elusive man and those working for him had done to Grayson. More than that, he'd been part of the team, and there was no way the elusive man would want people to find out what Cerberus had been up to. So if Grayson had been able to escape, somebody had been sent to kill him. Kai Leng, perhaps? Quite possibly. But it wouldn't be very smart to tell Jillian Grayson about his role in her father's captivity, and he didn't. I don't know, McCann lied, but one thing I can tell you is that your father talked about you all the time. Jillian's sorrow began to morph into anger as she thought about what had been taken from her. The only person other than Hendel that she could count on. She wiped at the tears with the back of her wrist.
I'm going to find out who killed my father. And when I do, they're going to die.
McCann nodded sagely. I don't blame you. Chances are the information you need is on the Citadel. There was no basis for that, at least not that McCann was aware of, but that was where he wanted to go. Omega was out of the question. I'll help you, he promised. We'll figure out who did it. That's ridiculous, Hendel put in. There's no way to find where the killer or killers went. Besides, how would we get there?
The slave ship.
Jillian proclaimed tightly.
We'll take the slave ship.
Hendel frowned. The slave ship? Why would the crew of the Adena give you that? It's theirs to recondition or sell. Jillian's mouth was a horizontal line.
They'll give it to me because I saved every single person on the Adena from slavery. Ask them, you'll see.
And much to Hendel's amazement, she was right.